Hi, can I speak to Champ?
Who?
Champ? Is Champ there?
Who is Champ?
Ser Duncan the Tall. Must have been quite a man.
When I think about a fantasy story, I'm thinking dragons, magic swords, and wizards. I'm not thinking about shit, piss, and vomit, about the hero rolling around in the mud and smashing someone's face in with a shield. But that is exactly what A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is about. And we're going to be talking about it today, partly because it's just an unbelievable show and I've been dunk-pilled hard by all the edits. But I specifically want to talk about class in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, because both the book and the show embody a more sophisticated understanding of class than we normally get in popular media, which I think is worth talking about. So let's crack on. The first thing that Knight of the Seven Kingdoms does really well, I think, is that it doesn't pussyfoot around what it means to be at the bottom of the social ladder. A lot of fantasy stories barely even touch on this. They focus on the princes and the princesses, and the small folk are left as part of the background aesthetic and the world building.
Where is Mama?
That's really not the case here. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms follows the story of Ser Duncan the Tall, who's not a famous warrior, he doesn't come from one of the great houses. He's a hedge knight, which is...
It's like a night, but sadder.
No, I'm not.
He's got to
sad.
sleep in the hedges.
He's basically a freelance mercenary, floating around offering to work and fight for local lords, which actually places him above, like, a farmer, but he's still pretty close to absolute poverty. And the show doesn't shy away from showing us that. Dunk doesn't even have a tent. He's spent his whole life living under trees and hedges, he eats shit food, and he has to sell the horse that he loves just so he can afford to compete in this local tournament. A tournament he decides to enter for economic reasons. He's not looking for glory, he doesn't expect to win. He's essentially putting himself in the shop window. He just wants to do enough to impress a lord into giving him a long-term job so he can eat some warm food, sleep in a proper bed, and maybe get a girlfriend. Because that's realistically the best he can hope for. Dunk is an orphan from the slums of King's Landing. He doesn't have an inheritance or any land, so all he can do is sell his body and his labour to one of these lords. Not unlike a sex worker, which is a comparison the show makes very directly. And like a sex worker, his status and lack of social capital is a barrier he's constantly having to overcome, often in completely mundane ways. There's a bit in the book where Dunk is trying to find the master of games so he can enter the jousting. And he sort of tracks down where this guy's meant to be, but he's not there. So he just has to sort of stand around waiting to see if he turns up. It's just so grounded. Then there's the fact that they almost don't let him compete because nobody will vouch for this random hedge knight. And the reason he ends up in this trial by 7, which is a sort of 7v7 team fight rather than a 1v1, is because Prince Arian, the guy he's meant to be fighting, knows that Dunk has basically no chance of finding 6 knights to fight alongside him, and that he can just pay them off if he does. So the first thing this story does really well is just showing us very viscerally how hard life is for people like Dunk. They really don't have anything. Every day is just a struggle to get by. And the people around him really don't understand his situation, that he's literally risking everything to try and pull himself out of. Because when you enter this tournament, you're gambling your horse and your armour, which is the only capital he has. So when his mate Lionel says,
"I have no chance, but it's a great honour to test oneself against a worthy foe,"
he's just living in a completely different world to this big friendly giant he kind of fancies. And I'll just point this out quickly, but the story's emphasis on the material struggles of people like Dunk is why the song at the end of the series is so perfect. 16 Tons by Tennessee Ernie Ford is a 1946 song about coal miners in Kentucky, and it's really a song about economic hopelessness. In those days, mining companies obviously owned the mines, but they also owned the towns that the miners lived in and the shops that they shopped at. So you had this system where they didn't even pay you in money. They paid you in company vouchers that you could use to pay your rent and buy your food, but the company decides how much they're going to pay you for every ton of coal that you mine, and they generally set the rate so you could almost never dig enough coal to afford to live. So you ended up in debt to the company you worked for and stuck wasting your life away in a kind of indentured servitude, enriching other people. You load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. It just really hits the theme of economic hardship. And functionally, the situation it's describing isn't that different to medieval feudalism.
16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt.
So the first thing that the show and the book do really well is that you see all of this struggle, because you just don't normally. But it is all pretty straightforward. We are historical materialists here at Brother Goose, and being lower class is ultimately about your material conditions. But it's not just about your material conditions. And where this story really nails it is in exploring the other ways this feudal class system manifests itself. First of all, it's important to realise that no system of power exists without some sort of justification. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian philosopher and Marxist in the 1930s. He had this idea that capitalism is made up of a base, which is the material structure of the economy, and a superstructure, which is a collection of cultural and ideological beliefs that help justify the oppression of the masses. Now, he was obviously writing about industrialised capitalism, but it's an idea that applies across the board. And feudal systems, like in Game of Thrones and medieval Europe, have their own ways of justifying themselves. There's a bit of Thomas Hobbes' social contract theory in there, where the king is meant to protect people from anarchy and violence. But I think the most important in this context is the divine right of kings, which is the idea that the king or the sovereign gets their authority directly from God, that they are the closest we can get to God on earth. And if that's what you believe, then these people become semi-divine beings. They're more than lesser men. Knighthood and chivalry are part of this ideology. They're a kind of myth-making that exists to justify the station of people born into incredible wealth. They aren't just above the rest, they're better than the rest, because they abide by the rules of chivalry and honour. And you see similar ideas all over the place. Grindset culture is basically doing the same thing. Elon Musk lying about being good at video games and his fans sort of dribbling over his genius is another kind of example.
You're actually like a world-class, incredible video game player.
Yeah. You have to be exceptional, period, as a human being.
Yeah.
There has to be something exceptional about you.
Yeah.
North Korea has a whole list of miracles associated with its leaders. And this sense of superiority is in some of our greatest stories. I love Lord of the Rings, but it kind of plays into this idea that there are certain special bloodlines and that those people are just better than the rest of us. This was just a very influential idea in medieval times, and it's also relevant in Westeros, where being a noble house involves nobility. The people in that lordly class are supposed to be special, they're different. And if you believe that, if society believes that, it has a lot of, real world effects. One of them is that you treat people differently. This is really what it always comes down to. On an evolutionary psychology level, categorizing people into different social identities is always about reducing uncertainty in how to behave around other human beings, and in predicting how they're going to behave around us. Class is just another example of that. We treat upper and lower class people differently, and there are different expectations around how to behave in their presence. You see this in the show, with the master of competition who has to sign off on letting Dunk compete. When he's speaking to Dunk, he's rude and dismissive. He's spitting in his cup the whole time. But when he's around the princes, he's shy and quiet. He's looking at the ground. He knows his place and how to behave differently towards people of different classes. And there's 2 points I want to make off the back of this. The first is that when social class is as important as it is in a feudal system, you need ways of quickly identifying what class people are in and therefore how you should treat them. That's where things like your clothes, accent, education level come in. They're all class signifiers. And again, the story illustrates these things really well. People are constantly commenting on Dunk's appearance, his scruffy clothes and his rope sword belt. Just by looking at him, they know they don't have to take him seriously, which contrasts with the proper knights who have this elaborate enameled armor and colourful doublets. At least they think this is a doublet, obviously. Don't really know what a doublet looks like. It's also accents, which is obviously quite hard to get across in a book. But in the show, a lot of the lower class people have regional accents, whereas the Targaryens have the received pronunciation, the Queen's English.
This is fucking nonsense.
And it's education. Dunk barely even knows who the knights he's hoping to compete against are, let alone what a trial by 7 is. And the story includes all of these things because they're ways the class system embeds itself in society. It's not just an economic thing, it's a cultural thing. And again, you just don't always see that sort of thing represented. There's a tendency to flatten the differences between social classes in a lot of modern media, which just maybe is because, all media today is put out by like 3 massive corporations who all have a vested interest in avoiding the issue of class altogether. But we're staying on topic today. Even more important than that, I think, is how having all of these different ways of signifying class, having class dictate how people are treated, and having all of these ideological justifications for the class system has a real impact on people's psychology. Both in the landed nobility, who become arrogant and entitled and see themselves as above everyone else, but also in the lower classes, who kind of internalize their own inferiority. And this is really the reason I'm making this video, because you see this with Dunk, who consistently feels that he doesn't belong, that he doesn't deserve to be in the presence of these great lords and knights. There's a bit in the show, which isn't actually in the books, where Egg asks Dunk why he treats these uppity lords like they're his betters. And Dunk says,
They are my betters.
which is just spot on. This is what the book does so well. People often talk about class as though it's something that's thrust upon the lower classes, which it is, but it's not that simple. Class is self-replicating. It's both top-down and bottom-up. It's a bit cringe to say, but the tragedy of classism is that it teaches poor people not to believe in themselves, that they deserve to be poor because they are inherently lesser. It's a kind of learned helplessness, a taught inferiority complex, which is a real thing in the real world. I remember reading a study when I was at university. I think it's this one, but I don't have access anymore because obviously we seal academia off to people who can afford to be a part of it, which looked at the self-perception of school kids in Northern Ireland. And it was specifically about kids from, real rundown working class areas going to grammar schools full of more middle class types, and how they were ashamed of, the clothes they wore, and they had just internalized this idea that they could never compete with the posh kids. They were always going to be not only on the outside socially, but worse, inferior. It's possible that I've imagined that specific story, but there are lots along these lines in Britain because we've had a feudal class system for 1,000 years and never had a proper revolution. So just to give you another example, there's been lots of work showing how working class kids kind of internalize the stereotype of being a bit stupid, so they end up thinking that school is pointless because they're not smart enough to be educated. And their response to that is to reject school for essentially cultural reasons. And you end up with this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of manual labour and impoverishment. Again, class has a cultural, sociological element. It's not just economic. And to see this psychological element of class represented in the story is just so good. For George to nail it like this, I just think shows what a master author he is. Okay, so finally, the best thing about Dunk and Egg is how it tears all of this bullshit down. Because Dunk isn't some communist leading a peasants' revolt to overthrow feudalism. Well, he kind of is. If you want to get into the symbolism of Dragon Slayer stories and how they're metaphors for rich lords hoarding their wealth in a castle, you can make that argument. Shout out David Lightbringer. But Dunk doesn't reject the feudal system. He's radical because he actually believes in it. He believes in the ideals of knighthood and chivalry. And it's his adherence to those ideals that exposes the feudal system for the fraud that it is. Because Dunk's crime isn't that he assaults someone, that happens all the time in this world. It's that he oversteps his class boundaries, which is a dangerous game to be playing. Prince Baelor even says that to Egg. He tells him that getting Dunk involved was no kindness. Baelor even says that he might have done the same as Dunk, but in his words,
But I'm a prince of the realm, not a hedge knight.
But Dunk got involved because of his belief in this system. All knights are sworn to protect the innocent, and he takes that oath seriously. That's all he does. And yet he can't even find 6 knights to fight for those ideas, to fight for what's right. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is ultimately a story about class. It's about how this orphaned hedge knight from the slums of King's Landing embodies the ideals of chivalry and knighthood more than all of these great lords, for whom honour is meant to be a part of their blood. That fact exposes the corruption and injustice of this feudal class system. And it helps Dunk to overcome this sense of these lords are just better than me, because he realises that being born into a noble house doesn't make you a knight or a good person. On the contrary, he starts to realise how damaging it can be to someone's character to grow up in that world. And you get all of that class consciousness in like 2 lines in the book. It's unreal. I've got 2 last points to make and then I have to stop because I'll just go on forever. The first is that this is also reflected in the different fighting styles between Aerion and Dunk. As Lionel puts it,
No man fights so fierce as one neglected by his mother.
Aerion is obviously way better trained. He's got some unreal moves. But a point the book makes especially clear is that Dunk grew up brawling in the dirt. He's a bit like Rocky, he's a street fighter. And after he spent the whole season struggling to play the same games as these highborn princes, he wins by dragging one of them down to his level and he just can't handle it. So I like that element. And I also like this funny class solidarity between Duncan, Red, Lady Rowan. Because Duncan's a good person and a great knight, but there are lots of hints in the book that he was never actually knighted and is lying his way into the tournament. Because again, that's the only real chance he has at a better life. Just like Red, who is obviously fibbing about being pregnant to back herself a better life with
The fucking apple boy!
Dunk realises that, but he doesn't say anything because he can relate to her struggle. And I just think that's a really nice, funny addition. It's just a great story that not only has a very sophisticated understanding of class, but charges all of us to uphold these ideals no matter the situation, to be a bit more Dunk. Thanks for watching. This is my first video in about a year because I low-key almost died, so bear with me, I might be a bit rusty with the editing. If you like the video, make sure you leave it a like so that YouTube knows it's worth promoting. Subscribe to the channel because there's more videos on the way and I know you need content. And shout out to all the boys on Patreon who haven't abandoned me, especially my OG, Jonathan Smith. And I think that does us. See you on the next one. Cheers.
Be gone, witch. Fuck off with you.
Yes,